Yeah, I can see people are joining now. I'll give them a few minutes to join. Still a few people joining, so I'll give a couple more minutes. Just wait 1 minute more to see if anybody else joins. Okay, well, I'll start with introductions anyway. So, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Billy Hume. I'm from Practice Evolve. For those of you who don't know, we provide business operating software to over 550 law firms, which currently service 10,000 users across Ireland, UK, and Australia. Today, I'm delighted again to be introducing Amy Bell, who'll be presenting today the second part of a three-part series of webinars. These webinars are designed to shine a light on important topics, including regulation, fraud, cybercrime, and issues that the firms are starting to consider for the future, including pricing and value in a world that's changing rapidly. Today, Amy will be talking about the new failure to prevent fraud offence due to be enforced within the next 12 months, what is expected in relation to sanctions compliance, the new requirements around proliferation financing, the SRA new fining powers in relation to economic crime, and practical tips on how to avoid them. Just a word or two on the software you're using. I'm pretty sure you all know how this works, but please use the Q&A button at the bottom to ask questions as we run through the presentation, and just avoid the chat button as I won't be keeping speed there. Anyway, with that housekeeping done, I'll pass it over to Amy.
Billy. Hello, everybody. Welcome back if you were in the first session that we did a couple of weeks ago. If you've not met me before, my name's Amy Bell. I'm a director of a business called Teal Compliance, and we help law firms with all the rules and the regulations that they need to follow. I'm a solicitor and I've specialised in anti-money laundering and financial crime for, oh goodness me, 18 years of my career. It's my very favourite thing. Trying to help people prevent money laundering or being exposed to the criminals. But as time has passed, the remit really has grown away or alongside, I should say, AML and terrorist financing to look at other areas of financial crime. And we're seeing in the last 12 months, particularly 12 to 18 months, particularly increased focus on other areas. So today I'm kind of parking my AML hat for a little while. I'm going to talk to you about the other areas of economic crime that are relevant to you. And in my experience, firms have got quite a developed program for AML. You've had it probably for quite a while. We're kind of 21 years into having to have AML policies and procedures. But these other things are new and probably not things you've got on your radar. Some of them may not affect you very much at all. Some of them might. So in today's session, I'm hoping to give you the kind of practical to-do list of what you've got to do, as well as AML in your economic crime program. A quick spoiler, you are probably going to have to expand your economic crime program away from just AML and terrorist financing, but also to encompass some of these other areas. You may start to be asked by regulators about information about these other areas. So let's get into it. We've got three main areas that I wanted to just talk about here. And the main ones are sanctions, fraud, and this failure to prevent economic crime and what that actually means. I'm going to start with sanctions. Now, sanctions isn't new, okay? Sanctions has always been a thing. It's just that the focus that the regulators have on it has become more keen. And when I say economic crime is the most political area of law that I've ever come across, you'll be able to see why. Because when global events happen, that then affects economic crime measures. And when it comes to sanctions, we've had, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine created a kind of explosion in relation to sanctions. But we had sanctions before that, often related to terrorists, jurisdictions, and people within jurisdictions that they felt were supporting terrorism more generally, or other places where the way they treat their citizens, the rest of the world aren't too happy with. So, you could think about North Korea, things like that. Sanctions are used by countries to try and discourage people, businesses, or countries as a whole from engaging in some sort of conduct that they find to be morally abhorrent, really. There is the jury is out whether they actually work or not, whether they do discourage people or they do change behaviours. But they keep putting them out, so I'm sure someone somewhere thinks that they're working. And for the vast majority of us that are working in, domestic-based law firms where we're working in our local areas, you might think this is just something I'm never going to come across, Amy. And that could be true. One of the things I might appeal to you to do is to look backwards and say, did you ever come across this as an issue? There are various types of sanctions. You've got trade sanctions, export sanctions, immigration sanctions. The ones we're really interested in are financial sanctions, okay? And the financial sanctions are set in the UK by OFSI, the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation, as part of the government. And they can move very quickly. They can issue sanctions and they be enforced, by 5 o'clock that day or by 9 o'clock the next day. They often want to have these enforced and keep it quite under the belt, because they don't want the people they're about to sanction to go and divest all of their assets. So you don't get a lot of warning on them. And so what it means for law firms is that you've got to have thought about the risk of you being exposed to sanctions and be able to react to them if you do have a sanctions risk. So let's just talk about what the risk is. The risk is that you as a law firm breach the sanctions in some way. And the definition of breaching sanctions is quite wide, really. It's loosely, we could get into the wording of all of the bits of the legislation, we'd be here all day, so we won't do that. But generally, sanctions is about making economic advantage available to a person who is subject to sanctions, to a designated person. Okay, so an economic advantage could be passing them some money. It could be improving the value of their assets in some way. There was a case relatively recently. We don't see a lot of sanctions cases, but there was one relatively recently where an old marketing company managed to breach the sanctions. There was a person who was sanctioned. He happened to own a vineyard. They ran a promotion on the wine from the vineyard that increased the value of the wine from the vineyard, and therefore was seen to be creating an economic advantage for the designated person. The poor vineyard marketing people who ran the competition would have had no idea, I imagine, about sanctions. This isn't something that's specific to lawyers. But there are various ways in which we as lawyers could breach the sanctions. So we could send some money to someone. We could participate in an activity where they're going to convert an asset, which could be a completely legitimate asset, by the way. It doesn't necessarily mean because someone's sanctioned that they've got dirty money or anything like that. But if we make that economic advantage available to the designated person, it is a strict liability offence. So this is different than AML. So in money laundering, you have to know or suspect before you can commit one of those big 14-year offences. In this, it's strict liability. You don't even need to know that you're breaching the sanctions regime to commit an offence. They're similarly, or not similarly at all, actually, in contrast to AML, there's no requirement to have specific policies and procedures in relation to sanctions compliance, but it's probably a good idea to think about what you should have. I'll come back to that in a second. Okay. Now, these sanctions, we often talk about the UK sanctions. You can search the UK sanctions list yourself. It's available. It's published by Office. They've got a really nice search function now. You can go on their website and search it. There are about 7,000 names on it. Some of them are based in the UK. Often, I think people just think about overseas sanctions risk and forget about the fact that there are some people in the UK. Now, I have heard the regulator, specifically the SRA, sometimes comment that there's a significant number of people in the UK on the sanctions list. Well, the sanctions list got 7,000 people on it. And I think there's something like 0.75% of those are in the UK. So there's some people on it, but not hardly any. And compared to the number of people in the country, I mean, it's minuscule, isn't it? But nevertheless, the risk of breaching the sanctions is pretty serious. A law firm who commits a criminal offence going to be dealt with, not only in relation to that criminal offence, but from a regulatory point of view. So the UK sanctions are important, but it's not just the UK sanctions that matter to you. You are also wanting to make sure you're on the right side of particularly the US sanctions. We often, when we do sanction screening, which we do usually as part of our client due diligence searching for AML, we often will search against the UK, EU, and the US ones. The US ones are the most important ones to consider there, as well as the UK ones, because your bank and your insurer are going to be interested in this. So I'll just break that down a little bit. Your bank, you might not know this about money. I didn't know about it until I learned about sanctions. Money moves through the international banking system in dollars. So if somebody is moving money across border, even though we might think that we're just changing it from pounds to euros or pounds to Australian dollars or something, what's actually happening is we're changing them from pounds to American dollars and American dollars into the currency. That's how it works. And as a result of the sanctions legislation that they bring out in America, any transaction that is taking place within dollars that concerns dollars will be impacted by the US sanctions. So that means money going through your bank account will be, your client account will be impacted by the US sanctions. So that's why banks are interested in, you might find yourself having questions from the bank about what's your exposure. Have you done a sanctions risk assessment? Do you think you're going to be exposed to sanctions? I'm aware of one bank in particular closing law firms' client accounts because they felt that there was a potential for that firm to receive funds from countries where sanctions are prevalent, particularly Russia. So your bank's interested. Also, your insurer's interested. If you haven't noticed it might not be your job to do this bit, but on your professional indemnity insurance renewal process prop form, you're likely to now be asked about sanctions exposure. Which countries do you do business in? Where do clients come from? And that's because your insurers are often backed by American insurance funds. So therefore, the American sanctions will bite. And so they will also be interested. Whether you are aware of the American sanctions and checking against them. So as I say, there's not really any regulations like we have in AML. In AML, we have the money laundering regulations, which sets out what our compliance program needs to look like in order to try and prevent AML breaches. We don't have a similar set of legislation in relation to sanctions. We do have guidance, though. There's a couple of sets of guidance you might be interested in. The first one is the SRA. If you are regulated by the SRA, they've issued some guidance. They are working on amended guidance that should land any minute now. But we do certainly have some. One of the main things I think that they're expecting firms to do, even though it's not required by the law, to be super clear about this, not required by the law, but they do think it would be sensible and would expect to see a firm has carried out a risk assessment about their sanctions exposure. So if, you know, I did promise you at the beginning, and Billy promised you some practical tips I was going to give you. So first practical tip, have a look at your client base. Have a look at where you're operating. Are you operating? I'll give you a clue in a minute at the jurisdictions that you need to think about. But have you ever been exposed to sanctions? Are you operating with clients from sectors where there might be sanctions risks? Shipping, aviation, immigration, these kinds of things. Look backwards and see if you've ever come across any. And make an assessment of risk. For the vast majority of firms, especially if you're local domestic firms, your sanctions risk is going to be minimal. It'd be, you know, really surprising if you ever came across sanctions in real life. But they'll want you to demonstrate you've thought about it. You don't need to have a whole load of sanctions policies and procedures. As I say, there's no requirement in the law. But if you do perceive you have a sanctions risk, you probably are going to want to have a sanctions policy. You're going to want to do sanctions screening, and you're likely to also want to test that that's actually working. So, you know, if you do perceive a risk, I think that's a separate bit of work for you. My guess is if you had a sanctions risk, you would already know this. And what I'm telling you is kind of grandma teaching you to suck eggs, because you know all this already. But for the rest of us, where the regulator is starting to ask questions, there's currently a questionnaire that needs to be completed during August from the SRA that asks a load of questions about sanctions and what your compliance is. So the SRA are interested in all sizes of firms, shapes and sizes of firms, and what you're doing in relation to sanctions. The second thing I would say about sanctions is, whilst you've probably had sanctions screening in your AML processes for ages, your lawyers probably have quite a lack of awareness of sanctions as a discipline of financial crime. We don't see it included in refresher training. We don't see it covered in any depth in normal AML training, unless you're a firm with a sanctions risk or a department where you're assisting people with sanctions. So I would also think about training and awareness of sanctions within the business. Again, it's not required by the law, so I'm not going to tell you you've got to do it, but I would advise you to have a think about, have we done at least sanctions basics for everybody so that they know what you're interested in? And that training is about surfacing the kinds of risks that you have. And the main one is based on the jurisdiction, because, as I said, sanctions are issued to discourage a country from doing something. So they're often anchored in jurisdictions. And so what we've got here on this slide is, if you're asking your lawyers to be aware of sanctions risk on individual cases, here's some red flags to think about. Okay, so jurisdictions that specifically we know that there are sanctions because there are concerns about how that country is operating. So a whole list of them there. Any jurisdiction with significant exposure to other UK sanctions regimes, so not just the financial sanctions, but the other ones in relation to trade and things like that. Jurisdictions that, while not subject to the dedicated regime, have a significant footprint of designated persons. So what do we mean by that? When a country like the UK issues a load of sanctions against particular individuals that, you know, where their wealth comes from a certain jurisdiction, say Russians, that what happens is the Russians leave the country and take their assets with them, and they go somewhere else. And so wherever that somewhere else is, if you're regularly dealing with that somewhere else, then you need to have a little think about it. So a lot of people, whether they were sanctioned or not, that would be happily have been hanging around in London before the Russian invasion of Ukraine have left London, and you might find them somewhere in the Middle East, where they feel that they are more welcome, because this, you know, the sanctions regime doesn't make you feel that welcome if you've been sanctioned and you can't spend your money here. So to be aware of where people are heading to when they're trying to escape a jurisdiction that's put sanctions against them. Then you've got jurisdictions that's a well-known established financial lists, particularly ones where they've had golden visa arrangements. So a golden visa is where somebody is given a visa when they commit to invest a certain amount of money in a particular jurisdiction. We had them, hence why we had lots of people that have got British passports that are not British, because they were able to get a visa and then become a resident and then get the passport as a result of investment in the UK. Moldova and Cyprus, particularly when it comes to Russia, are well-known connected jurisdictions. Jurisdictions listed by other regimes that are not us, and I say that, as I said, that's by looking at the international lists, not just our own lists. Or jurisdictions noticed as being able to provide services or entities to hide ownership. This is a very similar set of countries that we would look at in AML for high-risk third countries, or for secrecy jurisdictions, places where people are able to disguise the ownership of assets through shell companies or nominee shareholders and directors and things like that. So certainly, if we're just talking, you know, a transaction on Worcester High Street, you know, we're probably not talking about these things. But where you have an international element, or clients coming to you with an international element, you need to make sure you've surfaced with the lawyers that this is a risk and that you're paying attention to the sanctions. And just before I leave sanctions, I just talk about something that's slightly different than AML, which is about ownership and control. So when we're thinking about whether a person is a designated person or not, or whether they're subject to the sanctions, you would normally look at, when it comes to a company, someone with 50% more of the shares. Now, that's a different test than in AML. In AML, we're interested in beneficial owners, which have more than 25% of the shares. The sanctions, we're interested in people who have more than 50% of the shares. But what you should be aware of is that what we see when a particular regime is under scrutiny and at threat of sanctions, we see people divesting of their interests in case they become designated to other people around them, that they may have ownership, that they may have control over those people. So giving it to their children, giving it to business partners that they trust, or, you know, friends they've had for years, or these kinds of things, or wives or husbands or whatever. So just be aware that even if you've got something and the person you've screened doesn't come up with sanctions, but you know, there's some of these geographical issues, or a previous owner of this company is designated, to just consider whether that person still has control of that asset, because the sanctions will bite in that, even if on paper they don't own it. So practical things to watch out for there are companies particularly that have recently changed ownership, say within the last 18 months, and that the person who's got it doesn't appear to be a sensible person to have the ownership now. Why have you suddenly got it? You know, why have they given the nanny all of these shares or whatever that is, where it just doesn't make sense. Is it about control of that asset? So recently changed things. And then the other red flag I would look out for in those situations is someone who is a previous owner who is omnipresent in all of the correspondence who's being copied into everything. Why are they still involved? That's what you might want to ask yourself there. Okay, so proliferation financing. Proliferation financing is another one of these things. If you've got a proliferation financing risk, you probably know you have already. I'm not, there's nothing new. Proliferation financing is about the funding of transactions where the subject matter of the transaction is something that can be used to create weapons of mass destruction. Very niche, okay? But there is a UK national risk assessment of proliferation financing that you probably should be aware of. And you are now required by the Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Amendment Regulations 2022, number 2, to conduct a proliferation financing risk assessment. So even though this is sat in the AML legislation, it isn't really AML. It's something completely different. So the risk here with proliferation financing is that you've got transactions that are happening that appear to be for one thing, but really they're a cover, they're a front for transactions that could be used for something else. And they often go hand in hand with sanctions. You are thinking here about, again, a risk assessment. On that section there, it says you've got to carry out a risk assessment. And you're going to be looking backwards. What kind of clients do I have? What kind of jurisdictions are they in? The jurisdictions you're interested here are going to be transactions with countries, possibly with a geographical border to somewhere else that's sanctioned. So if you've got, just taking North Korea, right? You've got North Korea as a country who we believe has a program of developing weapons of mass destruction, but they're sanctioned, so they can't get the bits to do it. They can't get the parts to do it. So if I wanted to build a weapon of mass destruction in North Korea, what I would do is I would get get someone to buy the parts for me in a place where I've got a land border with them, and then they can pass them over the border to me. And obviously it wouldn't say these are electronic circuits for direction systems of missiles, but they will say these are electronic circuits for mobile phones, or these are electronic circuits for, I don't know, motherboards of computers, or sat navs, something. It would be dressed up as something else. Again, super niche. You're going to next to never see it. If you think, because you're a domestic local firm, this is not a thing for me, have a little think about it. Make sure you can demonstrate you've thought about it, you've asked around, particularly in your corporate departments. If you have a banking team, finance team, that's the team that's likely to be exposed here. If you have one of those teams, make sure you ask, how do we know we don't do this proliferation financing, and make sure you record that you've done that. And then if you're like, no, we've got no risk, then I think you're going to put in your firm-wide risk assessment, add a section that says proliferation financing risk. We've made these inquiries and we've never had this situation. We do not deal with these jurisdictions, and therefore we consider our risk to be low, and we are not implementing anything in particular in relation to it. If you do think that you've got proliferation financing risk, then you are going to want policies, controls and procedures like you do in AML. So you're going to want to make sure that you've got included in training that you do red flags for it. So these things about the kind of goods, chemicals, biological things, transactions in relation to biological goods, assets, electronics, what we call dual use goods. So where something could, a particular chemical could be used to clean things, or it could be used for making weapons. And are we involved in those kinds of transactions? And so you're going to want your lawyers to be aware of those kinds of dual use goods. So include that in training. And then if you do think you've got a risk, and in any event, probably you should be boxing off, do we have a proliferation financing risk? Now, interestingly, you've got your matter risk assessments that you need to do for AML. The SRA's template includes in their template a question on proliferation financing every time. Now, I think and I'm doing a piece of work on this at the minute, the the regulator may expect you to ask all the same questions they expect everyone to ask. I disagree with that. I think you need to ask the questions that are relevant for your business rather than asking all your lawyers to answer 7 pages of questions just because the regulator says that might theoretically be an issue. Just be aware that the regulator might expect you to have a specific question in relation to proliferation financing on your matter risk assessment, because there is one on their template. If you haven't got one because you think there's no risk, you've never come across it, you're never likely to come across it, then I think that's a reasonable position for not having it. But yeah, there you go. That's just how it goes with putting a template out there. You've got a balance, for me, having a template that's workable, people are going to complete, and then having asking questions for the sake of it. Okay, fraud. Let's move on to fraud. Now, if you were in the last session, we were talking about the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act and how that affected some things at Companies House. And the biggest thing in it, I think, and it held it up for quite a while, actually, the legislation was going through Parliament, was there's a new offence coming out called failure to prevent fraud. Now, we already have in the UK 2 failure to prevent offences. The first one is, and these are corporate offences, they bite on the law firm if the law firm fails to prevent something. So the 2 we already have are bribery, that we've had since 2010, and the facilitation of tax evasion, which we've had since 2017. So this one is coming. It will be in force when the government completes the guidance. You'll be aware we've just had a change of government, and so we haven't got a current ETA on the guidance. It may be out before the end of the year, and then they may set an in-force date. Now, this is unlikely to apply to the majority of firms because there's some size qualifications. In order for the offence to bite, it's supposed to only bite on large organisations, and large organisations have to have 2 of these 3 factors. The factors being more than 250 staff, 18,000 in assets, or 18 million in assets, or 36 million in turnover. So if you only qualify for one of those, you've got 250 people, but you don't hit the assets and turnover, then you won't be caught. So we think very few firms will be caught by this in the legal sector. Certainly not smaller firms. It's not intended to bite on smaller firms. However, that's the offence. The rest of us, though, I do think we need to think about fraud as a strategy. Again, you might have various fraud initiatives happening within your firm already around cyber, in infiltration fraud, vendor fraud, things like that. But have you got policies and procedures? Are you running training? You might be running training for your conveyances in relation to vendor fraud, and you might have thought about and put in something that sits on the bottom of your emails saying we never change our bank details for interception fraud. But have we actually got fraud as a kind of discipline, like we have AML as a discipline, like we have regulatory compliance as a discipline? If not, I think you probably do want to think about having, it as a work stream, so you can show. And the reason I think this is because one of the other things that the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act did was enable the regulatory objective that the regulators have to achieve to be amended from the prevention and detection of AML and terrorist financing to an extended definition of preventing and detecting economic crime as a wider definition. So in economic crime, you have got AML and terrorist financing, but you've also got sanctions, you've also got proliferation financing, you've also got fraud. So what that means is that the SRA at the moment, I've got this regulatory objective to make sure that you are doing what you should be doing for AML. This new regulatory objective means that the SRA, or your regulator, has got an obligation to make sure you've got things in place to prevent other types of economic crime. So even if you're not hit by the legislation because of your size, you might be required by your regulator to do similar activities because of this economic crime objective. And so that's why I think even if you're not automatically caught by the offence, you're probably going to want to think about it as if you did have to comply with the requirements. So failure to prevent offences don't have policies, controls and procedure requirements that AML has. So a bit like sanctions, there's no bit of law anywhere that tells you what you've got to do to be safe. However, the failure to prevent offences, all three of them, have got a possibility for relief from sanction if you have tried your best, basically. So taking fraud, for example. So failure to prevent fraud from an organisation point of view might be where you have a lawyer who is overcharging a client to make a billing target. They're charging a client for work they haven't done. That's fraudulent. And if somebody does that on your watch, someone who's employed by you or associated by you does that, then the firm, as well as them, commits an offence. They commit a fraud offence and you commit the failure to prevent the fraud offence. Now, and that's strict liability. However, in relation to failure to prevent, the government say that if you have got adequate or reasonable measures in place to try and prevent that fraud, then you should have relief from sanctions. You should have a defence to the offence. And so we're waiting for the guidance, which will detail what the reasonable procedures they'd expect to see are. If it's anything like bribery and tax evasion, it will likely you'll need to have a policy that says we don't do fraud. You'll need to do training that says do not do fraud. This is what fraud looks like. You might need to have reporting procedures for people and remind people of reporting obligations in relation to this. You might want to do due diligence on people, screening, things like that, especially people who might be associated with you that not particularly your employees that could expose you to the offence. And so all of those things, if you were already got a kind of bribery work stream or your failure to prevent tax evasion work stream, it'll be very similar work that you're going to have to do, training, policies, procedures, controls. But yeah, just because the offence doesn't apply to you, I wouldn't just think, oh, I don't have to think about this, because there is quite a lot of fraud that is potentially there. You've got internal fraud. And I think, as well as, when you're thinking about the policies, I always say, don't just put a policy in place. Think about how you're going to know whether people are actually doing it or not, following it or not. So, what are the internal controls that you need to have in relation to theft? Or, as I say, time recording, fabricating stuff. There was just a disciplinary case a couple of weeks ago about a junior lawyer who was working at home in COVID. It was under pressure to make sure they could demonstrate that they were still hitting their billing target, and they had fabricated some time recordings, and they were struck off. So, what have we got in place to make sure that there's accurate time recording? We've probably got cost estimates. Should we start thinking about flagging up cases that wildly exceed the cost estimate to understand why, whether that was appropriate? Now, when you spend time with a compliance person, we see all of the problems, right? So we can tell you, and the regulators would be the same. We can see when things go wrong, right? So we could say, oh, you could do that, we could do this, and we could do the other. You've got to do what's sensible and commercial. Never had an issue, and you don't expect to have an issue of internal fraud. I wouldn't go massively over the top, checking every case where they've exceeded the cost estimate. But that you are going to want to think about what would the clues be of somebody who might be committing internal fraud like that. The best advice I've got for you in practical terms is sit in the seat of somebody who did want to defraud the firm in some way and figure out how they're going to do it. And that's where you're going to focus your monitoring on. Cashiers, we saw one not long ago, cashier directing money to actually that was a lawyer, a relatively junior lawyer who was in financial difficulty, who directed some money to a friend of theirs. So as far as the cashiers were concerned, the red flags could have been the money going to somebody who wasn't the person name on the file, that kind of thing, a banking facilities breach. But also the other big clue there to me is people are in financial difficulty. I'm not saying everybody in your firm that has financial difficulties is going to become a fraud risk or an AML risk, but they are obviously having difficulties. So you will want to check that whatever policies and procedures those people are following, they actually are. I mean, you should be checking that anyway, right? But we've only got so many resources. This is why when we talk in AML about screening staff, and I think we're going to be talking about it in fraud, screening staff, what do we think the chances are as being infiltrated by someone who's going to do this? You know, people think that's about DBS checking and criminal records checks and things like that, and integrity checks at the SRA, and it's all part of that. But that's not the only thing. That's thinking about what the risk is of someone doing this and being exposed to criminals who are trying to get them to do this. And that, unfortunately, the way the world is, usually comes with some sort of issue that that person's got in their personal life or at work. So stress, personal circumstances, mental health issues, addictions, where they're likely to come into contact with people who could encourage them to do things. These are all things that you need to, they're nothing to do with the policy or procedure, these things. These are things that your supervisors need to be aware of for risk and to be flagging up. Certainly, if someone came to me with my head of risk and compliance hat on and said, you know, I'm really worried about X, they seem to be making a lot of mistakes. I know they've got some difficulties at home. I would be wanting to do additional screening in terms of file review and making sure processes are being followed in those situations. And that's just me from a nothing to do with the person. That's to do with a risk management strategy about I'm seeing risk factors, so I'm just going to check everything is fine. I know that some people feel that's a little bit controversial, but one of the problems we have is that when we do see these things go wrong, there's often been these warning signs that we've kind of given people the benefit of the doubt, and we've not taken those additional monitoring steps, and then we fall foul of them. So yeah, I, as a risk person, I think it's something that you should think about. Then you've got the external fraud. Now, you're probably doing something about these things already. I always say, get yourself credit for the work that you're doing by making sure that you've got this joined up work stream that says, in relation to fraud, we have this for cyber, we do this training, we do this phishing simulation of things to stop people opening attachments of emails and things like that. We check ID signatures on mortgage deeds to make sure that they match. We've thought about fraud tools. Checking whether people are who they say they are. We've not changed the bank details. We double check where they're going. We make sure money isn't being diverted to somewhere that we weren't expecting to send it to a third party. All of these things you probably already got in place. I think you need to be thinking about drawing that all together and saying this is our fraud, preventing fraud strategy, because these things will be owned by different people. Cyber might be owned by a data protection person. Mortgage might be owned by your AML person. Impersonation fraud might be owned by your finance person. You've got to bring it all together as a kind of work stream. And we've talked there about infiltration by people being corrupted or targeted by people just to get into your firm. And then we've got the infiltration through tech. You know, this isn't a data protection session, right? But I am hearing more and more of firms that are being targeted in cyber attacks, all coming from things where their spam filter has picked up the dangerous attachment, but the firm are that used to ignoring that they release it anyway. Okay. This is, I might have told you this last time. Billy, you can tell me if I did tell you about this, about sleeping cats. Did I tell you about sleeping cats? I might not have done. Sleeping cats, okay? My dad says, you know, people, when it comes to risk, are like sleeping cats. So if you've ever watched a cat sleep, like they just flat out, fast asleep, they hear a noise, they jump right up, well alert, look round, realise there isn't a dog coming to bite them, and they go straight back to sleep. like literally straight back to sleep. And you're like, hang on a minute, you were just on all fours then, looking around for a threat, and now you're back to sleep. I don't understand that. That's a sleeping cat. This happens with things we put in place to try and prevent problems. Risk management happens with AML. We do AML training. All the reports the money laundering reporting officer go through the roof. You know, it's a good time to decide whether you need to do AML training if you're getting no reports from your business. As soon as you do it, the reports go up because everyone's been alerted to the risks, and then they peter off because humans, like, if it's not really a dog, I'm not really worried. If I'm not really going to get bit on the bum, I'm not really worried. And so it's just human nature, right? And what's happening is you've done these penetration tests, you've put these, these spam filters in place. But because people are so used to, yeah, I get it, but, every time I have to do this, and then I release it from the quarantine, and then I do it. So the baddies are attacking with the same old stuff that you have tried to educate people, and they've just got to sleeping cat with it because they're like, oh, there was never a problem. You told me about this years ago, and I've had 500 of these since, and there's never been an issue. We only need one to cause the problem. Okay, so we need to continue to train people and remind them, and we need to respect and make sure people are respecting the controls you have in place. That's where I'd look. Who are the people who are wanting to release things from quarantine, or asking at, who are ignoring the control that you've put in place? They are the sleeping cats, and that's where your risk is with infiltration. So that's it from me. I don't know if you had any questions for me, Billy.
Yeah, so we do have one question from Joe Hughes, asking, is it possible to subscribe to an online platform that will email or notify when countries are added and removed from the sanctions register?
If you are using electronic verification, so you're using some sort of service that is going to do PEP and sanction screening, when they are added, they will update that, and you should check with your provider how quickly they update that for you, so that you can know. I do believe it is possible to subscribe to Offset updates where they will tell you when they add things as well. The main thing, so there are two things there. Yes, you can find out from Offset, you can register and they will alert you. There's also if you're on LinkedIn, there are two people that I would encourage that you follow. Victoria Turner and Zia Uller. They're at Eversheds, and they will always update when there have been new sanctions issues. They are right on top of it. They're the best people that I know that are on top of the sanctions risk. So you can subscribe to Offset, follow those on LinkedIn if you're on LinkedIn. Check with your provider. Will they let you know? They should be alerting you when they change their search parameters to add things. Now, I'm saying about adding, taking off, different. Okay, you can get notified about them taking things off. Whether your provider takes them off or not is a different kettle of fish. See, providers like to add things on, but they're nervous about taking stuff off. So even though you could get the official position, you'd need to check with your provider about whether they then remove that. It's not often that whole jurisdiction gets sanctioned. It's usually people from as well. So even if, a load of people that drop the sanctions against a load of people, there will still be other risks. I can see there's another question there, Billy.
Yeah, so we've just had another one come through from Helen. Often we will send funds to beneficiaries overseas of an executory or probate. I never realized that funds are charged to US dollars first. Would you be suggesting that we run sanctions reports their electronic verification of the overseas beneficiaries?
I would do sanction screening on anyone you're sending money out to, and this includes your litigation departments. One of the things about AML you'll know is that the litigation departments aren't as at higher risk as the transactional departments for AML. So often we don't run the same processes for them, for your litigation departments. The sanctions bite when you make funds available. So we might get into a habit when we're doing file opening of screening these things, but really for a sanctions risk, the best time to screen is when you're sending them money. So I certainly would encourage you to think about, if you're sending money to overseas beneficiaries, to be able to run that name through your sanction screening. That doesn't necessarily, I mean, you need to do ID and V on them anyway, so I would do the sanction screening, but it's the timing of it. If you're going to do it when you first identify you've got a beneficiary that you're going to pay out to, then that tells you a snapshot on that day, but the sanction doesn't bite until you send the money. So you might want to repeat it, or you might want to make sure your search provider will let you know if that person becomes sanctioned later on. Some of them do, you see. Some of them, once you've searched your name, as long as you tell them they're still an active name in your system, if anything changes, they'll let you know, but not all the providers work like that, so you'd need to check.
And then we just had another one from Jason. What if we're dealing with an estate and there is a beneficiary that has a sanction? We have the funds, can we still send?
No, don't do that. This is where it gets a bit tricky, right? Because you can't just keep the money forever. What the procedure would be is that you would need to apply to OFSI for a license to be able to send the money. Whether they give you that or not is a different kettle of fish, and they may require you to hold the money in the account and not do anything until the sanctions are resolved. If you were in that position as a law firm, I would encourage you very strongly to get legal advice from a sanctions specialist to make sure you are guided through that process, because the process of getting a license from OFSI is pretty complicated. And unless it's in your normal area of work in your firm to do, there's no reason you should know how to get it right. So if you ever needed any help at that point, you could definitely give me a shout and I will point you to my colleagues, certainly Victoria and Zia, who I've already mentioned, but there are quite a few other firms that I know that specialise in sanctions issues that can help you about that. But yeah, you would be right to be worried about that. Your bank would refuse to send it, probably, anyway, even if you wanted to.
Okay, if there's no more questions, please feel free to put some down. But I'll say thank you to Amy. I hope that everyone found that helpful. And we'll be sharing the slides with you in an email soon. Just before we go, I'd like to make everyone aware of the webinars we have coming up. We've got Amy's third installment, which is the law firm of tomorrow, and that's in 3 weeks' time. And then we have business development strategies for law firms, transforming lawyers into rainmakers. And this is by Scott Simmons from Legal Balance. And then we're working on a cybersecurity one back in October. We'll send out emails to everyone for these, and they're of course free to join. If there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks, Billy.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Billy. See you.